The insurance company gave him 48 hours. 48 hours to prove his father could receive adequate care at home, or they'd transfer him to a memory care facility in Marietta. The case manager's voice had been matter-of-fact over the phone, explaining coverage limitations with the detached professionalism of someone who delivered similar ultimatums daily. 3 professional caregivers had already failed in 6 months, each departure documented in clinical reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of declining function and escalating behavioral challenges. The first caregiver had pushed memory exercises that left his dad agitated and confused, insisting on flashcards and cognitive drills that seemed to highlight every deficit rather than building on remaining strengths. His father would sit at the kitchen table, struggling with simple word associations, while frustration mounted in his eyes, hands trembling slightly as he pushed the cards away. The second treated him like a fragile object, focusing only on preventing falls while his mind drifted further away from connection. She'd padded every corner, removed every possible hazard, creating a sterile environment that felt more like a hospital than a home. The third caregiver simply quit after a particularly difficult afternoon when his father threw a coffee mug, shouting about strangers in his house. Marcus had found the ceramic pieces scattered across the kitchen floor, his father standing in the doorway looking bewildered by his own outburst. The resignation letter arrived by email that evening, professionally worded but clearly final. At 19, managing a tech company he'd inherited when his mother died, suddenly was already overwhelming. The weight of quarterly reports, board meetings, and strategic decisions pressed against his chest every morning when he woke up in the too-quiet Buckhead mansion. Now he had less than 2 days to find a solution that had eluded trained professionals, or watch his father disappear behind the sterile walls of institutional care. The thought made his stomach clench with a combination of grief and panic that he'd learned to suppress during board meetings, but couldn't escape in the privacy of his own thoughts. He'd driven past the Marietta facility once, a clean brick building with manicured landscaping that looked pleasant enough from the outside, but felt like a warehouse for forgotten people. Marcus had been running the family software company for 8 months, ever since the heart attack took his mother on a Tuesday morning in March. She'd been the one managing his father's care, somehow making it look effortless, even as the Alzheimer's progressed from occasional forgetfulness to the comprehensive confusion that now defined their daily reality. He could still see her in the kitchen at 6 a.m., organizing pills into the weekly dispenser she'd color-coded, her movements efficient and purposeful, as she prepared his father for another day of fighting against the disease's relentless advance. The Buckhead mansion felt too big now, too quiet, except for the sounds of his father's confusion echoing through rooms that once held dinner parties and business meetings. The morning routine had become a careful choreography of medications: blue pills at 7, white ones at 8, the yellow capsule that had to be taken with food, all laid out in a weekly organizer his mother had perfected before she died. Marcus had tried to maintain her system, but lacked her intuitive understanding of which days required extra patience, which symptoms signaled the need for adjusted timing. He'd grown up assuming money solved problems, surrounded by evidence that the right check could hire the right people, that delegation and management principles applied universally to life's challenges. Write a check, hire the right people, delegate, and move on to the next quarterly target. But Alzheimer's didn't respond to quarterly earnings reports or board meetings, didn't care about his family's net worth or his company's market position. The disease had its own timeline, its own cruel logic that ignored his attempts to manage it like another corporate challenge requiring strategic planning and resource allocation. His father, who'd once commanded boardrooms and closed deals with handshakes, now struggled to remember his own son's name most days. The man who taught him to drive stick shift in the empty parking lot behind Lenox Square now needed help buttoning his shirts, his fingers fumbling with tasks that had once been automatic. Marcus would watch him struggle with simple fasteners, wanting to help, but knowing that taking over completely would steal another small piece of his father's remaining independence and dignity. The new house cleaner arrived on a Thursday morning, referred by his neighbor, whose mother had battled similar struggles until her death the previous winter. Maria Elena Santos came with references from 3 families, but no formal medical training, just experience caring for her own grandmother and an aunt who'd battled dementia for nearly a decade. She was 34, with calloused hands that spoke of physical work and an observant way of moving through spaces, noting things others missed or dismissed as unimportant. When she walked through the house for the first time, she didn't just see surfaces to clean or tasks to complete on a schedule. She saw pill bottles arranged haphazardly on the kitchen counter, their labels facing different directions, creating visual chaos that might contribute to confusion. Family photos were scattered across different rooms with no apparent chronological order, childhood pictures next to recent portraits in ways that might disorient someone whose sense of time had become fragmented. A man sat by the living room window in the same chair every morning, staring at Peachtree Street traffic with the vacant expression of someone lost in time. The first thing she did surprised him. Instead of starting with cleaning supplies or asking about schedules and expectations, she spent an hour just watching his father's routine. Not hovering or asking questions that might make him self-conscious, just observing from a respectful distance as he wandered from room to room, picking up objects and setting them down, searching for something he couldn't name. His movements followed patterns that weren't random. He always checked the front door twice, always touched the framed wedding photo on the mantelpiece, always ended up in the kitchen looking confused by the array of appliances. Most caregivers immediately tried to redirect or engage him, filling silence with cheerful chatter or structured activities designed to stimulate cognitive function. Maria Elena simply took notes on a small pad, tracking when he seemed most agitated, when he was calmer, what caught his attention long enough to interrupt his restless circling. Her approach felt different, more like scientific observation than caregiving. And Marcus found himself curious about what conclusions she might draw from data the medical team had never bothered to collect. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. He has good days and bad days, Marcus explained during her second morning, watching his father struggle to remember how to work the coffee maker he'd used for 20 years. The machine sat on the counter like an accusation, its digital display blinking 12 o'clock because no one had reset it after the last power outage. The doctors say it's normal with his condition, that we should expect more bad days as things progress. His voice carried the resignation of someone who'd accepted medical pronouncements as immutable facts, the way he'd learned to accept quarterly projections and market analyses. Maria Elena nodded, but didn't respond immediately. Her attention focused on his father's hands, rather than Marcus's explanation. She was watching how his father's fingers moved over the machine, not randomly, but following a pattern, muscle memory still intact, even when conscious thought had faded. His movements suggested he remembered the sequence: water reservoir, coffee grounds, filter placement, but couldn't quite coordinate the execution. The knowledge was there, trapped behind cognitive barriers that shifted like fog, sometimes clearing enough to allow function, other times obscuring everything familiar. "What kind of music did he like?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the morning traffic outside. It seemed like an odd question, completely unrelated to medical care or safety protocols. The professional team had never asked about music, focusing instead on cognitive tests, medication schedules, fall prevention measures. They documented symptoms and tracked decline with clinical precision, but rarely inquired about preferences, passions, or the small details that had once defined his father's personality and daily rhythms. "Jazz, I think," Marcus replied, trying to remember the last time music had played a significant role in their household routine. "My mother always had jazz playing in the kitchen when she was cooking dinner. Something about it helping her think." The memory surfaced unexpectedly, carrying with it the phantom scent of her perfume and the sound of her humming along with Miles Davis while she chopped vegetables. He hadn't thought about those evening routines in months, too caught up in crisis management to remember the small graces that had once made their house feel like a home. Maria Eleanor made another note in her small pad, the kind of detailed documentation that suggested she was building towards some larger understanding. "And coffee? He always made coffee for the family?" Marcus nodded, remembering mornings from his childhood when his father had been the designated coffee maker, up at 6 every morning, regardless of the season, grinding beans and preparing the perfect cup before anyone else was awake. It had been his contribution to family breakfast, his way of showing care through service. The next morning, Marcus found the kitchen subtly rearranged. Nothing dramatic or obviously different, but the coffee supplies were organized with careful attention to accessibility and visual logic. The grinder sat directly next to the machine, the filters were positioned where his father could reach them easily, and the coffee beans were transferred to a clear container that eliminated guesswork about contents and quantity. A small radio sat on the counter, tuned to WJZZ's, Atlanta's jazz station, the volume set low enough to provide ambience without overwhelming conversation. When his father entered the kitchen at his usual time, he paused at the doorway, head tilted slightly as Miles Davis drifted from the speaker. For the first time in weeks, he moved with something resembling purpose toward the coffee maker, his steps more confident than the shuffling gait that had become his normal way of navigating familiar spaces. His hands found the coffee beans without searching, measured them into the grinder with movements that suggested muscle memory was overriding cognitive confusion. Marcus watched from the hallway, afraid to break whatever spell had been cast by this simple environmental modification. His father's hands found the familiar sequence: beans into grinder, grounds into filter, water into reservoir. Not perfectly executed, some grounds scattered on the counter. The measurements weren't precise, but he was following the routine that had once been automatic. When the brewing cycle began and the familiar aroma filled the kitchen, his father's posture relaxed in ways Marcus hadn't seen since before the diagnosis. When he finally took that first sip and smiled, just for a moment, Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. Not hope exactly, because hope implied expectations that Alzheimer's had taught him to abandon, but something quieter and more sustainable. Recognition, perhaps, or the possibility that connection might still be achievable within the constraints of progressive cognitive decline. His father's smile lasted only seconds before confusion returned, but those seconds had been authentically him, the person he'd been before the disease began stealing pieces of his identity. "How did you know?" he asked Maria Eleanor later, finding her folding laundry with the same methodical precision she brought to every task, creating perfect stacks of shirts and towels that transformed chaos into order. Her movements were economical and purposeful, hands that had learned efficiency through necessity, through years of caring for family members whose needs couldn't be delegated or delayed. She didn't look up from her work, but her slight smile suggested she'd been expecting the question. "My grandmother forgot our names, forgot our faces, but she never forgot how to sing the songs from when she was young," she said, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience rather than professional training. "Memory lives in different places in the brain. Sometimes you just have to find the right door." It sounded simple, but Marcus realized the medical team had been using the wrong keys for months, trying to force cognitive locks that might respond better to emotional or sensory approaches. Over the following weeks, small changes multiplied throughout the house, each one seeming minor, but collectively creating an environment that worked with his father's remaining abilities rather than highlighting his deficits. Maria Elena moved family photos to follow a chronological progression. Wedding pictures in the living room where he spent most afternoons, baby photos in the hallway he traveled multiple times daily, recent family portraits near the kitchen where morning clarity was most likely to occur. She noticed his father always grew agitated in the afternoons, pacing restlessly between rooms and becoming increasingly frustrated with his inability to complete simple tasks. Instead of fighting this pattern with activities designed to calm him, she restructured the meaningful interactions during his clearest window, between 7 and 8:30 a.m., when consciousness felt less fragmented and his capacity for connection was strongest. The change required Marcus to adjust his own schedule, arriving at work later but spending the most productive part of his father's day at home. The breakthrough came during the third week, on a morning when March rain drummed against the windows and the house felt particularly empty without his mother's presence. Maria Elena had been experimenting with scents, introducing lavender sachets near his father's favorite reading chair and ensuring that traces of his mother's perfume still lingered in the master bedroom where her clothes remained hanging in the closet. The olfactory cues were subtle, not obvious enough to cause distress, but present enough to trigger associations that lived deeper than conscious memory. That morning, as coffee brewed and Ella Fitzgerald sang about blue moons from the kitchen radio, his father suddenly looked up from his cup with an expression Marcus hadn't seen in months. His eyes held a clarity that cut through the usual fog of confusion, a sharpness that suggested the person he'd been was still present, just temporarily accessible. "Where's Eleanor?" he asked, using his wife's name clearly for the first time since her funeral 8 months earlier. The question hit like a physical blow, carrying with it the full weight of loss that Marcus had been too busy managing practical details to properly process. His instinct was to correct, to gently remind his father that Eleanor had died, to orient him to current reality the way the medical team had recommended. But something in Maria Elena's expression stopped him, her slight shake of the head suggesting that correction might not be the most therapeutic response to this moment of connection. Instead of correcting him, Maria Elena sat down across from him at the kitchen table, meeting his confusion with acceptance rather than facts that might cause additional distress. "She's not here right now," she said gently, her voice acknowledging the emotional truth of his longing without challenging his temporal confusion. "But you miss her, don't you?" His father nodded, tears forming in eyes that had been empty for so long, emotions rising to the surface with an intensity that suggested feelings remained intact even when factual memory had become unreliable. "She made the best apple pie," his father continued, his voice stronger now, animated by a memory that had survived the disease's destruction. "Every Thanksgiving, she'd get up at 5 in the morning to start the crust. Said the secret was keeping everything cold, even the rolling pin." The memory was vivid, detailed, accessible when approached through feeling rather than chronological fact. He could describe the texture of the crust, the way she'd arranged apple slices in perfect overlapping circles, the careful balance of cinnamon and nutmeg that made her pie legendary among their circle of friends. Marcus had been taught to correct these moments, to gently remind his father that his wife had died, to orient him to current reality as a way of maintaining cognitive function and preventing further confusion. But watching Maria Elena validate the emotion rather than challenge the timeline, he began to understand something the medical textbooks had missed. The feeling was real even when the timing was scrambled. Love didn't follow the same rules as linear memory, didn't decline on the same predictable trajectory as cognitive function. The insurance company's case manager arrived for the evaluation on a Tuesday morning in early April, clipboard in hand and skepticism written across her professional demeanor. Patricia Williams had seen too many families promise changes they couldn't sustain, too many expensive home care arrangements that collapsed within weeks under the pressure of round-the-clock caregiving demands. Her job required her to make objective assessments based on measurable outcomes, not emotional appeals or temporary improvements that might not reflect long-term stability. But when she observed the morning routine, something made her pause in her documentation. Marcus's father moved through his coffee preparation with confidence that hadn't been evident in previous assessments, humming along to the jazz playing softly in the background. His movements were still slower than normal, still required occasional guidance, but the agitation and confusion that had characterized previous evaluations was notably absent. When she asked him questions, his answers were still confused about time and place, but his manner was calm, his responses appropriate to the emotional context, if not the factual reality. "How many hours of sleep is he getting on average?" she asked, noting the organized medication schedule and the consistent daily structure Maria Elena had established over the past month. Sleep disruption was common in dementia patients, often leading to sundown syndrome and increased behavioral challenges that made home care unsustainable. 7 to 8 hours regularly, Marcus replied, consulting the log Maria Elena had been keeping. He goes to bed when the sun sets, wakes up naturally around 6. Sleep had been irregular for months before Maria Elena arrived, but the structured routine and reduced afternoon stimulation had restored a natural circadian rhythm. "Episodes of aggressive behavior?" Patricia continued, cross-referencing her notes from previous visits when his father's frustration had been a significant safety concern. Marcus looked at Maria Elena, who'd been tracking everything in her detailed notebook, documenting not just incidents, but the circumstances that preceded them, looking for patterns that might predict and prevent future outbursts. 3 episodes in the past month, Maria Elena reported, down from 12 the month before the new routine was established. The numbers were undeniable, representing a dramatic improvement that couldn't be attributed to medication changes or natural disease progression. But numbers alone wouldn't have been enough to convince someone who'd seen too many temporary improvements followed by inevitable decline. What ultimately swayed Patricia's assessment was witnessing a moment of genuine connection during her evaluation. While she was reviewing medication compliance, Marcus's father approached her with a cup of coffee he'd prepared independently, offering it with the same hospitality that had once made him successful in business dealings. The gesture was small but significant in ways that transcended clinical measurements. It demonstrated awareness of others, initiative to help, multi-step task completion, and social appropriateness that suggested preserved function in areas the medical team had written off as permanently compromised. These weren't abstract cognitive measurements that could be manipulated or misinterpreted. They were glimpses of the person still living inside the disease, still capable of contributing to social interactions when the environment supported rather than challenged his remaining abilities. The company approved continued home care, but Marcus knew the real test was sustainability. Could they maintain this progress over months and years rather than weeks? More importantly, could he learn to support what Maria Elena had built without managing it to death, without imposing the corporate efficiency models that had served him well in business but might destroy the delicate ecology of care she'd created? His instinct was still to optimize, to systematize, to create processes and metrics that could be scaled and replicated. But the most important metric couldn't be quantified in insurance reports or medical assessments. The frequency of moments when his father's eyes showed recognition, when humor flickered across his face, when he moved through his environment with dignity rather than confusion. These moments couldn't be manufactured or scheduled, only encouraged through the kind of patient attention to individual patterns that Maria Elena had mastered through years of caring for family members whose needs couldn't be addressed through standardized protocols. The corporate world demanded different skills than caregiving required, and Marcus was slowly learning to navigate between these different approaches to human challenges. Board meetings responded to decisive leadership, clear directives, quantifiable results that could be presented in PowerPoint slides and quarterly reports. Caring for his father required patience he'd never had to develop, attention to subtleties he'd been trained to delegate, and acceptance that progress wouldn't follow the linear trajectory of business growth or market expansion. Some days were better than others, and Marcus learned to measure success in smaller increments than his business training had taught him to value. Some weeks brought setbacks that seemed to erase apparent gains, reminding him that Alzheimer's progression couldn't be permanently halted, only temporarily slowed or made more bearable through environmental modifications and emotional support. But the overall trend was toward connection rather than isolation, engagement rather than withdrawal, dignity rather than the institutional warehouse storage of human beings whose cognitive function no longer met society's productivity standards. If this moment is hitting home for you, tap like. It helps more people find stories that matter. Maria Elena taught him to read the signs that predicted good days versus difficult ones, how his father's posture changed when he was becoming overwhelmed by too much stimulation, which activities were genuinely stimulating versus merely agitating, how to structure conversations around feelings and sensations rather than facts and timelines that had become inaccessible. She showed him that asking, "How are you feeling?" worked better than, "Do you remember me?" because emotions remained remarkably intact, even when specific memories became unreachable or distorted by the disease's progression. The transformation wasn't just in his father's daily experience and functional capacity. Marcus found himself leaving work earlier, spending mornings at home during his father's clearest hours, instead of rushing to beat Atlanta traffic to downtown meetings that could just as easily be scheduled for mid-morning. He moved the most important client calls to 10 a.m. after he'd had time to witness whatever small victories the day might bring. Successful coffee preparation, recognition of familiar faces, moments of spontaneous humor that proved his father's personality remained intact beneath the cognitive confusion. Coffee preparation became a shared ritual rather than a source of anxiety about safety and competence. Some mornings, his father completed the entire process independently, measuring grounds and timing the brew cycle with precision that seemed to emerge from muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. The days required gentle guidance, Maria Elena's hands covering his to help him remember the sequence, her voice providing verbal cues that bridged the gap between intention and execution. Both outcomes were victories in their own way, proof that support could enhance rather than replace remaining abilities. The real turning point came during the 4th month of their new routine, when Marcus faced a business crisis that would normally have consumed 18-hour days for a week straight, the kind of emergency that had once defined his approach to leadership and problem-solving. A major client was threatening to leave, taking nearly 30% of annual revenue with them, citing delays and communication breakdowns that threatened their own project timelines and client relationships. The old Marcus would have cancelled everything else, lived at the office, managed every detail personally until the problem was resolved through sheer force of attention and resources. Instead, he found himself considering what Maria Elena might do in a similar situation. Step back, observe the patterns, look for underlying needs rather than surface demands. What if the client's anger wasn't really about project timelines, but about feeling unheard, undervalued, treated like a contract rather than a partnership that deserved ongoing attention and care? Instead of throwing more resources at faster delivery, Marcus spent time listening to their actual concerns, validating their frustrations without immediately jumping to solutions that might not address the real problems. He discovered that their threats weren't just about missed deadlines, but about feeling like their feedback was being ignored. their changing needs dismissed as scope creep rather than natural evolution of a complex project. The approach worked, not just for resolving that immediate crisis, but as a template for leadership that valued relationship alongside results. His father's condition continued to fluctuate in ways that reminded Marcus that Alzheimer's progression couldn't be completely controlled or predicted, but the catastrophic decline everyone had predicted never materialized. The structured environment Maria Elena had created provided stability that slowed progression and maximized remaining abilities while preserving the dignity that institutional care too often sacrificed for efficiency and standardized protocols. More importantly, it honored who he had been while accepting who he was becoming, allowing space for both grief and celebration. The changes at home began influencing how Marcus thought about business leadership and employee relationships in ways he hadn't anticipated. When a long-time employee started showing signs of burnout instead of just increasing performance pressure or threatening job security, Marcus considered what environmental factors might be contributing to the problem. When communication broke down between departments, instead of implementing new reporting systems that might increase bureaucracy without improving actual collaboration, he looked for ways to create natural connection and shared purpose. The lessons of caregiving, patience, attention to individual patterns, validation of emotional experience, environmental modification rather than forced compliance, turned out to be surprisingly effective leadership tools. Employees responded to being seen as complete human beings rather than interchangeable resources, to having their concerns heard rather than immediately dismissed, to working in environments designed around human needs rather than abstract efficiency metrics that ignored the reality of how people actually functioned best. Spring arrived early that year, with dogwood trees blooming along Peachtree Street, while March still had weeks remaining on the calendar. Atlanta's unpredictable weather patterns providing an unexpected gift of beauty and warmth. Marcus and his father established a routine of sitting on the back porch during the morning coffee hour, watching birds visit the feeders his mother had installed years earlier. Small cardinals and blue jays that provided movement and color without requiring conversation or cognitive engagement. Some mornings they talked, his father sharing memories from decades past with startling clarity and detail, stories about building the business from a two-person startup to the regional software company it had become. Other mornings they just sat together in comfortable silence, two people sharing space and time without the pressure to perform or remember or be anything other than present in the moment. These quiet times had become as valuable as the conversations, proof that connection didn't always require words or shared understanding of current reality. Maria Elena had been with them for 6 months when Marcus realized he hadn't thought about institutional care in weeks. The crisis that had initially brought her to their family now seeming like ancient history rather than an ongoing threat. His father wasn't cured. The Alzheimer's continued its slow progression, stealing pieces of recent memory while leaving older recollections surprisingly intact. But he was stable, engaged, and most days recognizably himself in ways that mattered more than clinical assessments could measure. The house felt lived in rather than managed, warm rather than clinical, filled with small sounds and routines that created texture and meaning beyond mere safety and medication compliance. The morning jazz playing softly in the kitchen, the systematic organization of objects that supported rather than challenged his father's remaining abilities, the rhythm of daily activities that honored both his need for structure and his capacity for independence within appropriate limits. The company's annual board meeting that year included a presentation Marcus had never expected to give, a proposal that emerged directly from his personal experience navigating work-life balance while caring for a family member with complex ongoing needs. He proposed expanding employee benefits to include comprehensive home care support for family members with chronic conditions, recognizing that caregiving responsibilities were becoming increasingly common as the population aged and medical advances extended life without necessarily preserving cognitive function. The business case was straightforward and compelling: reduced employee turnover, decreased absenteeism, improved focus and productivity when people weren't torn between work demands and family responsibilities that couldn't be postponed or delegated. But the personal case was stronger, rooted in his own discovery that supporting the whole person, not just their professional function, created loyalty and engagement that no salary increase or stock option plan could match. Employees who felt supported in their complete lives brought more creativity, more commitment, and more resilience to their professional responsibilities. The vote was unanimous, though Marcus suspected some board members were motivated more by competitive advantage than humanitarian concerns. Within 3 months, the company had partnered with local agencies to provide care coordination, respite services, and specialized training for families navigating dementia, disability, and chronic illness. Other Atlanta businesses began inquiring about similar programs, recognizing both the moral imperative and the practical benefits of supporting employees as complete human beings, rather than compartmentalized workers whose personal challenges were irrelevant to corporate success. What started as Marcus's personal crisis was becoming a model for corporate responsibility that recognized the reality of modern American families, where caregiving responsibilities cut across all demographic lines and required workplace flexibility that traditional benefit packages hadn't anticipated. The ripple effects extended beyond their immediate employee base, influencing industry conversations about sustainable work-life integration in an aging society where traditional family support systems had been disrupted by geographic mobility and changing economic conditions. His father's improvement continued to surprise the medical team, though Marcus had learned to define improvement differently than the clinical measures that focused primarily on cognitive testing and behavioral incidents. Not improvement in the sense of recovery. Alzheimer's doesn't work backwards, and everyone involved understood that the overall trajectory remained toward further decline, but improvement in quality of life, in maintained function, in moments of connection that everyone had assumed were permanently lost when the diagnosis was first delivered. The structured environment Maria Elena had created, combined with activities that engaged preserved abilities rather than highlighting deficits, had provided space for the person to exist alongside the disease, rather than being completely overshadowed by diagnostic categories and medical management protocols. His father was participating in meal preparation, folding laundry with careful attention to detail, maintaining a small herb garden on the back porch that provided sensory stimulation and physical activity appropriate to his current abilities. These weren't complex cognitive tasks that could be measured by standardized assessments, but they were purposeful activities that provided sensory stimulation, physical movement, and social connection, while allowing him to contribute to household functioning rather than being purely a recipient of care. More importantly, they were contributions rather than just therapies, ways for him to give back to the family system rather than being defined entirely by his needs and limitations. By summer's arrival, with its familiar combination of heat, humidity, and afternoon thunderstorms that cooled Atlanta's evenings and brought the sound of rain against windows, the insurance company's annual review had become a celebration rather than an anxious evaluation of continued eligibility. The metrics were impressive by any clinical standard: 90% reduction in aggressive episodes, consistent sleep patterns that followed natural circadian rhythms, maintained ability to perform activities of daily living with minimal assistance that preserved dignity and autonomy. But beyond the numbers that satisfied bureaucratic requirements, the reviewers saw something rarer in dementia care and more valuable than statistical outcomes. They witnessed genuine contentment, a quality of life that transcended cognitive function and suggested that the person's essential well-being had been preserved despite the disease's progression. His father moved through his days with purpose and dignity, supported but not managed, cared for but not infantilized, respected as an individual rather than treated as a collection of symptoms requiring professional intervention. Marcus presented their story at a conference on innovative approaches to dementia care, sharing the stage with Maria Elena, who had initially been reluctant to speak publicly about methods that hadn't been formally studied or validated through clinical trials. But her insights about family-centered care, about reading individual patterns rather than following generic protocols, about the importance of preserving identity alongside managing symptoms, resonated with professionals who'd been trained to focus primarily on safety, medication compliance, and behavioral management rather than quality of life and human dignity. The approach wasn't universally applicable. Every person with dementia had different needs, different preserved abilities, different sources of comfort and agitation that required individualized assessment and environmental modification. But the principles were transferable across diverse family situations and care settings. Observe before intervening. Build on strengths rather than constantly correcting deficits. Honor the person's emotional reality, even when their factual understanding is compromised. Create environment and routine that support rather than challenge remaining capabilities. As autumn arrived, painting Atlanta's trees in familiar reds and golds that marked seasonal transition in ways his father could still recognize and appreciate, Marcus realized the year had taught him more about effective leadership than his previous business education combined. Real leadership wasn't about having all the answers or controlling all the variables in complex systems. It was about creating conditions where others could contribute their best abilities, recognizing expertise wherever it existed, and building systems that served human needs rather than just organizational efficiency or abstract productivity metrics. His father's diagnosis hadn't changed, and the medical team's long-term prognosis remained realistically guarded. The Alzheimer's continued its progression, stealing new memories while leaving emotional connections and procedural knowledge surprisingly intact in ways that challenged standard assumptions about cognitive decline. But the family's response to that diagnosis had transformed not just their daily experience, but Marcus's understanding of what it meant to care for people, whether family members, employees, or community members, in ways that honored their full humanity rather than reducing them to their most obvious deficits or limitations. Share your thoughts in the comments about what surprised you most in this journey. Every perspective helps others facing similar challenges. The winter holidays approached with less dread than Marcus had expected, based on previous years when celebrations had become exercises in managing his father's confusion around changed routines, extra visitors, and disrupted schedules that challenged his need for predictability and structure. But Maria Elena helped him understand that the goal wasn't to recreate past celebrations exactly, but to preserve the emotional core, gathering, sharing, expressing gratitude, in ways his father could still access and enjoy without being overwhelmed by complexity or social demands that exceeded his current capacity. They simplified the Thanksgiving menu, focusing on familiar dishes his father could help prepare without feeling frustrated by complicated procedures or timing requirements that might trigger anxiety. Instead of the large gathering that had been traditional when his mother was alive, they invited just a few close family friends who understood the situation and could interact naturally without making his condition the center of attention or trying to test his memory in ways that felt more like interrogation than conversation. His father couldn't remember all their names anymore, but he recognized faces, responded to warmth and genuine affection, and contributed to conversations in ways that felt meaningful rather than forced or artificial. The social skills that had made him successful in business relationships remained largely intact, allowing him to be gracious and hospitable even when specific details about guests' lives had become inaccessible. His emotional intelligence had survived even as his factual memory had become unreliable. The most powerful moment came during the blessing, a tradition his mother had always led with words that balanced gratitude with acknowledgement of life's uncertainties and sorrows. His father, who rarely spoke in complete sentences anymore, suddenly began reciting words that had been part of family gatherings for decades. For the food before us, the family beside us, and the love between us. His voice was clear, confident, drawing from memories that seemed immune to the disease's destruction, accessing ritual knowledge stored deeper than conscious recollection. Everyone at the table felt the presence of his mother in that moment, the continuity of family identity that transcended individual memory and connected past traditions with present realities. The blessing had been hers, but his father's recitation carried it forward, proving that some forms of inheritance operated beyond cognitive function. Love and ritual could persist even when the people who originally created them were no longer present to maintain them consciously. Christmas morning brought its own revelation about the nature of gift-giving and celebration within the constraints of progressive cognitive decline. Marcus had worried about presents, knowing his father might not understand the concept of exchange gifts or remember receiving items from one moment to the next. The traditional approach to holiday celebration assumed memory continuity that was no longer possible, creating pressure to recreate experiences that might only highlight current limitations rather than celebrating present capacities. But Maria Elena suggested focusing on sensory experiences rather than objects that required memory to appreciate fully. A soft blanket with familiar texture that provided immediate comfort. A photo album with pictures from his father's childhood arranged chronologically to support rather than challenge his sense of personal history. A music box that played his wedding song and could trigger emotional memories even when factual details had become inaccessible through conventional recollection. Pathways. When his father opened the music box and heard the first notes of "The Way You Look Tonight," his eyes filled with tears, but his smile was radiant with recognition that transcended cognitive analysis. He couldn't explain why the song mattered or recall the specific wedding memory it represented, but the emotional connection was immediate and profound, bypassing the damaged neural pathways that would have been required for factual remembrance, while accessing emotional associations that remained remarkably intact. He held the box close to his chest, swaying slightly to the melody, present in the moment in ways that transcended cognitive function and reminded everyone witnessing the scene that the person they loved still existed within the disease's constraints. The gift wasn't about creating new memories that might not persist, but about honoring existing emotional connections that could still be accessed through the right sensory keys, the right approach to triggering associations that lived deeper than conscious thought. By January, the one-year anniversary of his mother's death, Marcus realized how much had changed in their family's capacity to navigate grief, challenge, and unexpected growth within circumstances they never would have chosen but had learned to manage with increasing grace and effectiveness. The day that had once seemed like an insurmountable tragedy, losing the family's primary caregiver, inheriting responsibilities he felt unprepared for, facing his father's decline without the emotional and practical support that had made it manageable, had become the beginning of a different kind of family story. Not the story they had planned or would have chosen if given alternatives, but one that revealed strengths they hadn't known they possessed and connections they hadn't realized were possible within the constraints of progressive cognitive decline. The crisis had forced them to discover resources, emotional, practical, and relational, that might never have emerged under different circumstances, capabilities that had been dormant until necessity demanded their development. The business continued to thrive under Marcus's evolved leadership style, but his definition of success had expanded beyond traditional metrics to include factors that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or shareholder value assessments. He listened more carefully to employee concerns, assumed less about their motivations and capabilities, created space for others' expertise to emerge, rather than imposing solutions based solely on his own analysis of complex situations that required multiple perspectives to understand fully. The employee benefits program they'd developed around dementia care had expanded systematically to include support for all kinds of family caregiving situations that modern American workers faced with increasing frequency. Aging parents with various chronic conditions, special needs, children requiring ongoing therapeutic support, spouses dealing with mental illness or substance abuse recovery, siblings managing disabilities that required family coordination and advocacy within medical and social service systems that weren't designed for easy navigation. The company's reputation for supporting work-life integration had attracted top talent from across the Southeast. Professionals who were looking for employers that recognized them as complete human beings rather than interchangeable resources, whose personal responsibilities were irrelevant to corporate productivity. This holistic approach to employee relations translated directly to improved performance, increased innovation, and reduced turnover that more than compensated for the increased investment in comprehensive benefits and flexible scheduling arrangements. Maria Elena had become more than an employee within their household ecosystem. She was family in the truest sense, a trusted partner in maintaining his father's quality of life, while enabling Marcus to balance multiple responsibilities without sacrificing either professional effectiveness or personal caregiving commitments. Her insights continued to surprise him with their depth and practical applicability, observations about human behavior and environmental factors that seemed obvious in retrospect, but had escaped everyone else's attention. She noticed when his father's afternoon agitation coincided with changes in barometric pressure that preceded Atlanta's frequent thunderstorms, adjusting indoor activities accordingly to provide calm alternatives during weather-related anxiety spikes. She recognized that his longest periods of lucidity occurred when he felt useful and needed, so she created simple tasks that allowed him to contribute meaningfully to household functioning while working within his current cognitive and physical capabilities. Spring returned to Atlanta with its predictable beauty and renewal, cherry blossoms blooming in Piedmont Park, and warming temperatures that allowed for longer morning walks through their Buckhead neighborhood. The seasonal transition brought increased energy and engagement that seemed to benefit his father's overall mood and functional capacity. Baseball season's return had once been a shared passion between father and son, though the complexities of modern game strategy now exceeded his father's processing abilities. His father couldn't follow the intricate statistics and strategic decisions that had once fascinated him, couldn't remember players' names from inning to inning, or track the narrative arc of individual games that required sustained attention and memory continuity. But he still recognized the fundamental rhythm of baseball, the crack of the bat making contact, the crowd's collective response to dramatic moments that transcended specific knowledge about teams or players and connected to emotional memories of summers spent at Atlanta Fulton County Stadium decades earlier. They developed a comfortable routine of listening to Braves games on the radio during afternoon rest periods. His father settled in his favorite reclining chair with a glass of sweet tea, Marcus working on his laptop nearby, but available for conversation when his father felt moved to offer commentary. Some innings brought surprisingly astute observations that demonstrated intact knowledge of baseball's fundamental principles, the strategy behind intentional walks, the psychological pressure of close games, the importance of situational hitting that transcended individual statistics. Other times, he would doze off peacefully during slower periods of play, but comfortably, surrounded by familiar sounds and the security of knowing someone he trusted was nearby. The games provided structure for their afternoons together, without requiring constant active engagement, background that could accommodate both conversation and comfortable silence, depending on his energy level and cognitive clarity on any particular day. The 2-year anniversary of his Alzheimer's diagnosis approached without the fear and dread that had once accompanied such medical milestones, dates that had previously felt like markers of inevitable decline and approaching loss. His father's condition had stabilized rather than declined precipitously, as the medical team had initially predicted, confounding expectations about rapid deterioration that had influenced their original recommendations for institutional care and palliative management rather than active intervention. More importantly, the family's capacity to provide meaningful, dignified care had grown stronger and more sustainable rather than wearing thin under the accumulated stress of constant vigilance and emotional demands. They had learned to work with the disease rather than against it, to build on preserved abilities rather than constantly mourning lost functions, to find joy and purpose within circumstances that required daily adaptation but no longer felt like unmanageable crisis. Marcus began speaking at other conferences beyond the dementia care community, sharing their story with business leaders, healthcare administrators, and policymakers who were grappling with similar challenges at institutional and societal levels. The message wasn't that love could cure Alzheimer's or that home care was always superior to professional institutional services that served important functions for families without adequate resources or support systems. The message was more nuanced and practical. Dignity, connection, and quality of life were achievable even within the constraints of progressive dementia if caregivers learned to see the person rather than just the diagnosis, if systems could be designed around human needs rather than administrative efficiency, if society could recognize that cognitive decline didn't eliminate someone's essential humanity or their capacity to contribute meaningfully to family and community relationships. The impact extended beyond their immediate situation into broader conversations about aging, disability, and social responsibility in communities that were rapidly demographic transitions toward older populations requiring more complex care coordination. The company's approach to employee support had been studied by researchers at Emory University and Georgia Tech, academics who were documenting innovative corporate responses to America's aging population and the increasing number of workers managing family caregiving responsibilities alongside professional obligations. Their preliminary findings suggested that companies investing in comprehensive family support saw measurable returns, not just in employee loyalty and productivity, but in the development of leadership skills that served organizations well in increasingly complex and unpredictable business environments. The abilities that caregiving required, patience, observation, adaptation, emotional intelligence, systems thinking, were exactly the competencies that modern leaders needed to navigate uncertainty, manage diverse teams, and build sustainable organizational cultures. More personally, Marcus had discovered capabilities within himself that he never knew existed before circumstances demanded their development. The young man, who had once managed primarily through delegation and hierarchical control, had learned to provide hands-on care with patience and increasing skill, to read subtle behavioral cues that indicated needs before they became crises, to find satisfaction in small improvements that might not be visible to casual observers, but represented significant victories within the context of progressive cognitive decline. The executive, who had measured success purely in financial terms and market position, had developed genuine appreciation for achievements that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets or board presentations, moments of connection, preservation of dignity, creation of environments that supported rather than challenged human limitations. Demonstration that care itself could be a form of leadership that influenced others toward more compassionate and effective approaches to complex human challenges. The son, who had taken his parents' care and sacrifice for granted throughout his childhood and adolescence, had become someone who understood the profound gift of being able to give back to the person who had given him life, education, and the foundation for his own success. This reciprocal relationship had deepened rather than burdened their connection, creating new forms of intimacy that transcended cognitive function and proved that love could adapt to changing circumstances without losing its essential power. Summer brought its familiar rhythms to their established routine. Morning walks before Atlanta's heat became oppressive. Afternoon rest periods during the most uncomfortable hours when humidity made outdoor activities unpleasant. Evening time on the back porch, listening to night sounds and sharing comfortable silence or occasional conversation as his father's energy and clarity allowed. These seasonal adaptations had become automatic, requiring no special planning or medical consultation. His father's engagement with the natural world remained remarkably intact, despite the cognitive changes that affected other areas of function. He could still identify bird species by their calls, drawing from knowledge acquired decades earlier and stored in neural pathways that seemed resistant to the disease's destruction. He still appreciated the changing colors of sunset, the play of light through leaves, the simple sensation of warm air moving across his skin during comfortable evenings when humidity levels dropped enough to make outdoor sitting pleasant. These moments had become precious in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated when the diagnosis was first delivered, and their focus was entirely on managing symptoms and preventing behavioral crises. Not because they were rare, his father's capacity for sensory appreciation remained quite consistent from day to day, but because they represented a form of presence and contentment that had nothing to do with cognitive performance or memory function or any of the measures that society typically used to assess human value and capability. In a culture that equated personal worth with productivity, mental sharpness, and independent functioning, his father's quiet satisfaction with simply existing, with experiencing beauty and comfort, without needing to analyze or remember or perform, had become a kind of spiritual teaching about what mattered most fundamentally in human life. His contentment challenged assumptions about what constituted a meaningful existence and suggested that dignity could persist even when conventional markers of competence had been compromised by disease. The business world continued to evolve around them, with increasing recognition that traditional approaches to leadership, employee relations, and organizational culture needed substantial updating to address changing workforce realities and demographic trends that were reshaping American society. Marcus found himself invited to speak at conferences not just about dementia care, but about adaptive leadership, comprehensive employee support systems, and sustainable approaches to work-life integration that recognized employees' complete humanity rather than compartmentalizing their professional and personal identities. The skills he had developed as a caregiver, careful observation of individual patterns, patient response to behaviors that might seem irrational without understanding their underlying causes, flexible adaptation of environments and expectations to support rather than challenge people's current capabilities, had proved surprisingly valuable in corporate settings where traditional command and control management styles were becoming increasingly ineffective for motivating complex knowledge work and managing diverse teams. Paul's return marked 6 years since his mother's death and 4 years since Maria Elena had joined their family, anniversaries that now felt like celebrations of resilience and adaptation rather than reminders of loss and crisis. The transformation in their daily experience had been gradual but profound, evolving from emergency management of cognitive decline to sustainable rhythms that accommodated his father's needs while allowing other family members to maintain their own growth and development within a caregiving context. What had once felt like crisis management, requiring constant vigilance and emotional depletion, had evolved into predictable routines that provided security for his father while offering Marcus and Maria Elena opportunities to pursue their own interests and professional development. The care system they had created was sustainable precisely because it didn't require anyone to sacrifice their complete identity to caregiving demands, but rather integrated those responsibilities into lives that remained rich and multifaceted. The holiday season approached with genuine anticipation rather than the dread that had characterized previous years when celebrations felt like obstacles to navigate rather than experiences to enjoy. They had developed traditions that worked within the constraints of his father's condition, while preserving the emotional essence of family celebration, rituals that honored the past while acknowledging present realities without attempting to recreate experiences that were no longer possible or appropriate. Christmas morning would involve simple pleasures that engaged his father's preserved capabilities, familiar music that triggered positive emotional associations, comfortable clothes that provided sensory satisfaction, easy foods that he could help prepare without frustration, and most importantly, the presence of people who accepted him exactly as he was without pressure to perform cognitively or socially beyond his current capacity. The gifts would focus on sensory experiences rather than objects requiring memory to appreciate. New Year's Eve would be spent at home by choice rather than limitation, reflecting their family's preference for quiet celebration over the large parties that had once been part of their social calendar. Their tradition involved watching classic movies from his father's youth, sharing memories triggered by familiar faces and scenes from Hollywood's golden age, reflecting on the year's unexpected gifts alongside its acknowledged challenges and the ways their family had continued to adapt and grow within circumstances they never could have anticipated. As the year concluded, Marcus realized that his father's Alzheimer's diagnosis, which had initially seemed like an unmitigated tragedy that would destroy their family's future, had revealed possibilities for connection, growth, and meaning that might never have emerged under different circumstances. The disease had certainly stolen important capabilities and cherished plans, had caused genuine grief, and required difficult adaptations that no one would have chosen voluntarily. But it had also forced their entire family to slow down enough to appreciate small moments that busy lives had previously overlooked, to pay attention to forms of communication that transcended words, to find meaning in simple interactions that didn't require cognitive sophistication, but revealed the persistence of love, dignity, and essential humanity even within the constraints of progressive neurological damage. These discoveries had changed not just how they managed his father's care, but how they approached all their relationships and responsibilities. The business continued to thrive under Marcus's evolved leadership approach, but his definition of thriving had expanded to include metrics that couldn't be captured in financial reports or operational dashboards. Employee satisfaction surveys consistently showed high ratings for work-life balance, family support, and overall job satisfaction that translated into reduced turnover, increased innovation, and stronger client relationships built on trust and collaboration rather than purely transactional exchanges, focused solely on deliverables and profit margins. Client relationships had deepened as Marcus's more patient, attentive leadership style created partnership dynamics that purely efficiency-focused approaches had never achieved. His ability to listen carefully to underlying concerns rather than just surface complaints, to respond to emotional needs alongside practical requirements, to maintain connection even when communication became difficult, served him well in boardrooms and negotiation settings where empathy and emotional intelligence were becoming increasingly valuable competitive advantages. Maria Elena had become something of a recognized expert on family-centered dementia care throughout the Southeast, speaking at professional conferences and training programs that were incorporating her insights about individual pattern recognition, environmental modification, and dignity preservation into standard care protocols. What had begun as one family's desperate search for alternatives to institutional placement had evolved into a model that was influencing how the medical community approached dementia treatment more broadly. Her insights about reading individual behavioral patterns rather than following generic protocols, about creating supportive environments that worked with rather than against cognitive limitations, about maintaining dignity and purpose even within the constraints of progressive disease, had resonated with healthcare professionals who had been trained to focus primarily on safety, medication management, and behavioral control rather than quality of life and human dignity as primary treatment goals. Spring's arrival brought renewed energy and expanded possibilities, as daylight hours increased and Atlanta's temperatures warmed enough to make outdoor activities comfortable again. His father's morning walks extended naturally as weather conditions improved, and the herb garden on the back porch, now in its fourth season, had become a reliable source of both sensory stimulation and practical contribution to family meals, proof that meaningful engagement could persist within the constraints of cognitive decline. The most remarkable ongoing development was his father's relationship with neighborhood children who had learned to interact with him naturally, without the discomfort that many adults showed when confronted with cognitive impairment they didn't understand. Children seemed to connect with him through emotional channels that bypassed the intellectual deficits that made adult conversations difficult, engaging through play, humor, and shared appreciation for simple pleasures that adults often dismissed as insufficiently sophisticated. Watching his father with these young visitors, Marcus saw glimpses of the grandfather he might have been under different circumstances, the patient teacher and gentle companion that his personality had always contained, but that cognitive decline had made more visible by stripping away the social masks and professional preoccupations that had previously shaped his interactions. The disease had certainly stolen many planned experiences, but it had also revealed qualities that might have remained hidden in a life focused primarily on achievement and accumulation. The fifth anniversary of his mother's death passed quietly, marked by a small family gathering that focused on gratitude rather than grief, celebration of resilience rather than mourning of loss. His father's condition had stabilized at a functional level that none of the medical professionals had predicted when the diagnosis was first delivered, and institutional care had seemed inevitable within months rather than years. The longevity and quality of his home-based care had exceeded every expert expectation. He required constant supervision and assistance with many daily activities, but he remained recognizably himself in all the ways that mattered most to people who loved him. His kindness had persisted, his appreciation for beauty and comfort continued, his capacity for affection and humor survived even when short-term memory had become unreliable, and factual knowledge about current events had faded beyond retrieval through conventional conversation or cognitive testing. Marcus had learned to measure success using completely different criteria than his business training had taught him to value, focusing on preserved capabilities rather than lost functions, celebrating moments of connection rather than mourning conversations that were no longer possible, viewing caregiving demands as opportunities to practice forms of attention and patience that enriched every other aspect of his life, rather than as burdens that constrained his professional or personal development. The company's comprehensive approach to employee and family support had been studied extensively by researchers documenting innovative corporate responses to demographic changes and changing workforce needs. Their preliminary findings confirmed what Marcus had discovered through personal experience. Companies that invested in supporting employees as complete human beings, with complex family responsibilities and caregiving obligations, saw measurable returns in loyalty, productivity, creativity, and the development of leadership capabilities that served organizations well in unpredictable business environments. More personally, Marcus had discovered aspects of himself that would never have developed without the specific challenges that his father's condition had presented. The young executive who had once equated leadership with control and delegation had learned to provide intimate physical care with skill and tenderness, to find deep satisfaction in achievements that couldn't be measured in quarterly metrics, to understand that true success was often invisible to external observers, but profoundly meaningful to the people most directly affected. The son, who had taken family stability and parental care for granted throughout his privileged childhood, had become someone who understood reciprocity as a fundamental principle of meaningful relationships, who appreciated the gift of being able to give back to someone who had sacrificed for his education, opportunities, and foundation for success. This reversal of care roles had deepened rather than burdened their connection, creating new forms of intimacy and mutual dependence that transcended cognitive function. Summer's familiar patterns provided structure and comfort as they entered what felt like a sustainable long-term rhythm rather than a temporary crisis management phase. Morning activities during cooler hours, afternoon rest when heat and humidity made outdoor engagement uncomfortable, evening relaxation on the back porch, listening to familiar sounds and enjoying comfortable companionship that required no performance or special effort from anyone involved. His father's appreciation for sensory experiences remained remarkably consistent and accessible, providing reliable sources of pleasure and engagement that didn't depend on memory, analysis, or cognitive processing that had become unreliable. The texture of soft fabrics, the taste of familiar foods, the sound of gentle music, the visual beauty of natural light filtering through leaves. These simple experiences continued to bring him obvious satisfaction and contentment that reminded everyone around him that quality of life could persist within significant limitations. As autumn returned with its reliable cycle of cooling temperatures and changing foliage, Marcus reflected on how fundamentally his understanding of leadership, success, family, and human value had been transformed through circumstances he never would have chosen, but had learned to navigate with increasing grace and effectiveness. The crisis that had once threatened to overwhelm their family had become the foundation for discoveries about resilience, adaptation, and the persistence of love within conditions that challenged every assumption about what made life worth living. His father would never recover the cognitive abilities that Alzheimer's had stolen, and the disease would continue its gradual progression toward further decline in ways that remained unpredictable and largely beyond their control. But their family's capacity to provide meaningful support had grown stronger and more sustainable over time, proving that care itself could be transformative for everyone involved, that limitations could reveal new sources of meaning, and that the most important measures of success were often the ones that couldn't be quantified in conventional terms, but were unmistakable to anyone who witnessed them directly. That possibility, that other families facing similar challenges might find hope and practical guidance in their experience, that young caregivers might discover their own unexpected strengths and capabilities, that society might learn to support aging and disability with greater creativity, compassion, and recognition of persistent human dignity, had become Marcus's most meaningful inheritance. Not just the business his mother had left him, but the opportunity to demonstrate that care could be a form of leadership that influenced others toward more humane and effective approaches to the challenges that awaited everyone who lived long enough to need support themselves.